Regardless of whether or not you suffer from a mental illness, I think to most people it is obvious that there's an often unbridgeable gap between your intellect and your emotions. That is, it's possible to know something intellectually but not know it emotionally, or not be able to feel it emotionally. And likewise, you might know something emotionally, but you can't really justify it in intellectual terms. And I find this is especially true when it comes to the most fundamentals of life. There are certain truths that are very obvious, that are easy to explain, and are logical. And you can learn about them intellectually pretty easily, but actually internalizing them and making them a part of your emotions is very difficult. Examples of this would include being able to take a loss. That is, being able to admit when you failed, being able to move on, being able to learn from your mistakes, not throwing good money after bad, stuff like that. It's very hard for people to admit they're wrong. It's very hard for people to admit they failed. Likewise, it's very easy to understand how envy is a bad thing and will make you miserable, whereas learning to be more satisfied with what you have and grateful for the blessings you do have will make you a better and happier person. I think, though, the thing that's the hardest to accept, and maybe that's because this is a little harder intellectually than some other things, is that at a fundamental level, you're not responsible for what other people do. And this is an extremely important but poorly understood concept, and it's something I always cringe whenever I see in fiction. Like, probably a good example is in fiction all the time you have people being held hostage or threats like, if you don't do this, I'm going to blow up this building or I'm going to kill random people or stuff like that. And the hero's of the opinion that if they don't do what the bad guy says they should do, then they're just as guilty as the bad guy for blowing something up. Well, they aren't guilty at all. They're not the one who's blowing stuff up. They're not the one who forced that people into that situation. They're not the one who's trying to blackmail them. So even if the hero does nothing and the other guy blows everything, like blows up a bunch of innocent people, at a base level, they're in no way morally responsible for that. Now, contextually, if they're a police officer or something like that, or they have a position of authority and they don't stop them, you could argue that that's them abdicating their authority or not doing what they're supposed to do. But even so, if a police officer fails to stop a criminal, it's not as if he's the one who shot the person that the criminal shot. That's not how things work in the real world. And this belief that you are responsible for other people's actions, that you should take them onto yourself, and that you should try to help them as if they were your own problems, is something that really plagues decent or good people. Because a decent or good person sympathizes with people who are in a bad situation, is able to put themselves in that situation and say, if I was there, I would want someone to help me, and tries to help that person out. Now, while it's certainly meritorious and good to try to help somebody out, their success or failure in life, unless you're in a particular position of authority or responsibility, isn't really something that you should be judged on. For instance, if you have a friend or family member who's a drug addict, you aren't responsible for them being a drug addict. If you try to help them and ultimately they relapse or you aren't successful, I think it's meritorious and it's good of you to put in the effort, even though it's not necessary on your point of view, because as Jesus says, you treat people the way you want to be treated. If you believe that in a similar situation, you would hope that someone would try to help you with your drug addiction, then yeah, it's certainly a good thing to try to help somebody else with their drug addiction. But if you ultimately fail, that's not on you. That's not your fault. It's not your responsibility. So those are kind of more extreme examples, but let's get into kind of some more mundane ones. So a lot of my family friends have children who are just completely screwed up. They're drug addicts, they're sexual deviants. Some of them join cults. One of them is a dangerous criminal who drives at 100 kilometers per hour with a suspended license in a neighborhood, residential neighborhood. A lot of them are just fucking horrendous human beings. And I find even though they're in their 20s and 30s, their parents will still cover up for them. Some cases they'll lie to the police, they'll keep funding their horrible lifestyles. They won't try to do anything to get them going. And I kind of feel by that point in time, you aren't responsible necessarily for your children's actions or their bad decisions. Now, if you want to help out your kids because they're your children and you love them, that's obviously a very good thing to do. But if it's destroying you or hurting you, you might have to just tell them to screw off. Because in a lot of these cases, what I find these horrible kids do is they will guilt their parents by saying, oh, this is your fault because of the way you raised me. This is because, I don't know, society's to blame. You didn't shelter me. You didn't provide me with opportunities. You didn't support my nonsense when I was younger. And I'm unable to work or do anything with my life because of that. And they'll say this into their 20s and 30s. And a family member of mine is in his mid 60s and he still maintains that and tries to guilt my 92-year-old grandfather into giving him money and funding his lifestyle because he was never able to get anywhere because his parents weren't supportive enough. And there's another thing that some of them do where they'll hold their grandkids hostage. And they'll say, unless you give me money and keep enabling my nonsense, I'm never going to let you see your grandkids or something like that. Now, once again, it's the job of a parent to take care of their kids, to a certain extent, even when they're adults, because family is family and blood is blood. And the parental child relationship mirrors the one that God has with us all as humans. And it is important, but the Bible also says, honor thy father and mother. And if your kid treats you with complete and total contempt, they try to screw with you, they emotionally manipulate you, they do all this stuff, then I don't think there's anything wrong with just cutting them off and just going, until you can act like a civilized human being, you're gone. And I'm using this in extreme examples. Everybody's got into fights with their parents. Everyone's yelled at their parents. Everyone's had their parents yell at them. I'm sure there's some people here maybe haven't. But people get frustrated. Emotions run high. Even with your best friends, sometimes you get angry and yell at each other. What's important is you all come back and apologize, etc. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like your kid is just an unrepentant, complete and total degenerate who's continually disrespectful to you, especially in public, who undermines you, stuff like that, then yeah, it's perfectly fine to cut your kids off. I mean, even if you look at the story of the prodigal son, he went back and asked forgiveness and begged for forgiveness. And I think this extends far beyond familial examples, or I guess kind of extreme examples like I presented earlier. This also extends into the context of work, where you're often a rather small cog in the machinery. And because someone else didn't plan ahead or screwed up or miscalculated, that doesn't mean it's your job to take responsibility for it. Now, it's probably your job to fix it and to work with them to do it, but I'm not really talking about the work side. I'm talking about the guilt side. Because because your company like screwed up, they didn't plan something properly. It's an emergency on Sector 7. If this isn't done in the next 10 minutes, everything's gonna collapse. You might have to like work on it because it's your job, but that's not your fault. You shouldn't feel guilty about that. You shouldn't feel responsible for that. It's not your moral duty to ensure everybody else is doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, if you're a manager to a certain extent, it is, but if your manager planned really poorly and your company's in a bad position, that's not on you. Likewise, if you decide to help somebody go above and beyond, like maybe someone you know is struggling, you stay a bit after work to help them out. You didn't have to do that. That's a good thing to do, as it's a generous thing to do. But if that person tries to guilt you into staying late again, then you aren't responsible to do that. Their success or failure, unless, like I said, your HR or the manager or something, is not your direct moral responsibility. And once again, just to be very clear, I'm not saying you shouldn't help people. I'm not saying mentoring people and giving them a break, and if you can, doing what you can for your fellow man is a bad thing. If anything, that's very much what Christ teaches us to do. I'm just saying it's not a detriment to you. It's not a demerit to you if you don't take on these things that aren't you aren't directly responsible for. And this is very hard because you want to do a good job. You want to love your kids. You want to give people second and third and fourth chances. And it's very hard to not internalize these things and to not feel guilt for things that you had no control over. The truth of the matter, most of what happens in life is beyond your control. Um, you're born a certain way with regards to like your intellect, oftentimes your basic talents, aspects of your personality, your socioeconomic status. You're shaped a lot by your parents, the world around you. It's often kind of up to chance whether or not you meet certain people who help you out in your life in the way forward. There's a lot of different stuff in it, and your ability to influence it is rather minimal in a lot of cases. That's not to say don't try, but to a certain extent, you just have to accept that in the grand scheme of things, you have a very limited responsibility for what's going on. There's, what, 6 or 7 billion other people who are making decisions every day that are directly influencing you, and you aren't responsible and you can't control any of those other people's decisions. So if you're able to mentally accept this on an emotional level, you'll be a much happier person in life. But that's the extremely difficult thing to accept, and I know I'm not very good at it, but I think it's something worth talking about and something worth acknowledging. Because as G.I. Joe says, knowing is half the battle.